Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Lifters League podcast, the Strength and Muscle Science podcast. In this episode, me and Gus talked with Hayley Forrest, who is a sports dietitian who blew our minds with a heap of stuff. You've been working with her for a while as well, haven't you, Gus?
So, Hayley is my sports dietitian who I work with in powerlifting, mainly just for my own competitive reasons, and I apply the same principles I do when I'm trying to find information and trying to find smart people. And yeah, she absolutely blew our mind. So, a bit of background about her. So she has a master's degree in dietetic studies from the University of Queensland, a Bachelor of Health Science, ISSN Sports Nutrition Specialist, ASCA Strength and Conditioning Coach, and also a registered sports dietitian. So she has huge experience in bodybuilding, working with strength coaches and strength athletes, performance athletes, fighters, all sorts of areas, and her expertise is in biochemistry and metabolism. And the major thing that we discussed in this episode, was an entirely new concept to me when she tried to apply some of these methodologies to me, is supercompensation with dieting. And this effect absolutely put a whole perspective on the way I approach nutrition when it comes to sports performance. That, well, I guess you're going to have to hear for it yourself, because it's quite a big topic. But if you want some serious performance enhancement and muscle gain through metabolism manipulation, then these are some of the ideas or methods to look into.
Awesome.
All right, guys, enjoy the episode.
I feel like I ramble and go off on big tangents a lot.
That's the point.
Yeah, that's what I end up doing in my workshops. When I do my workshops, I always have the time I need to be at by the next dot point.
Yeah.
Because I'll always be stuck on a tangent on some dot point up here. And then I realize I've already gone like 5 topics ahead of myself. So I have to keep myself accountable when it comes to...
I'm the worst wormhole person.
What?
I'm the worst wormhole person in the world. Like, I can literally blink and 15 minutes have gone by and I've been talking about this like thing that's not even related. I'm awful. All right, yeah, so you can move it around. So you want it, so it's just in front of your face?
Yep.
Yep. Sounds great. We're good to go.
What I wanted to talk about was, it was actually quite fascinating when you first brought up the supercompensation when it came to dieting.
Yep.
So I've always known the concept with it behind with strength and conditioning, and like as per the textbooks, it's like maintaining a level of fatigue or stimulus that kind of pushes or upregulates recovery responses. But I hadn't thought about it with diet, but I mentioned to a few people, and I remember it happening to myself after a post bodybuilding comp I did, and a few other people where they gained a heap of muscle and gained a heap of strength. I think my bench press at the time went from like 140 to 170 in like a matter of like 2 months, and I think I added something like 30 or 40 kilos to my deadlift.
Jesus.
In that period of time.
Yeah.
So I haven't experienced gains like that since.
So just for people listening who have no idea what we're talking about, what is supercompensation as a concept? Like, as a top level concept, obviously we're going to dive into it. But
would you call it supercompensation with diet?
It is. It's a glycogen supercompensation.
Just glycogen, was it?
That's the mechanism in which you have those performance benefits.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a multitude of different metabolic factors that end up super compensated, if you will, from being undernourished. So essentially we put someone in an undernourished environment, which is a diet, for a period of time. When you're in an undernourished environment, your body will adapt to it. Mm-hmm. So you'll upregulate metabolic enzymes to enable you to get more out of the nutrition. What that results in is when you go to reintroduce that same level of nutrition that you started with, you have an increased capacity in order to deal with that. So you get a super compensated effect, which in regards to sports performance, we see that with, increased lifts, increased muscle gain, because the muscle gain happens when you increase the stimulus, in combination with increasing those metabolic factors that result in increased lean mass. Because you've been in that undernourished environment, you'll have more result happening from it.
Okay, right. So this is really interesting. So from a general population point of view, is this the mechanism that I remember you telling me, Gus, when it comes to diet? Obviously, you've got the general I want to lose weight diets. People who chronically undereat, that's when they start plateauing and they seesaw, right? Because basically they've adapted to the lower calorific intake. Is that right? And what you're doing is you're getting somebody there and then springboarding them back to where they were?
Yes and no.
Okay.
It's also what attributes to dieting is easy.
Yeah.
Reverse dieting is not easy.
Right.
So people will sort of lose weight quite easily and then they'll stack weight on very, very easily.
Of course. Yeah.
With regards to people who chronically diet, you'll find that they'll chronically diet and then have periods of binging associated with it. Yeah. So part of that is physiological, part of that is psychological, and it's sometimes hard to tease out the difference between the two. So your body does metabolically adapt. So my business, it's founded on that concept of metabolism is dynamic. So when you're constantly undereating, your body is metabolically designed to adapt to that so you don't starve to death. You think about the way that our genetics are designed and our physiology is designed. We're designed for a hunters and gatherers lifestyle. Yeah. And up until, the last 200 years or so, that's pretty much what we were doing, where hunters and gatherers doesn't mean I'm eating paleo. What it means is food was available in surplus and then food was available not very much at all. So it's either feast or famine. So if you think about in a hunters gatherers lifestyle, if we're eating meat, there's not this constant ready supply of cows walking past. You'll have a herd come past, right. You eat a lot of the herd, and then the herd disappears for a while. In that time frame, our body adapts. So our metabolism is designed to store energy, store food, and then in times where it's not available, we conserve, which results in metabolically, we'll have a decrease in metabolic rate. That can be a variety of different functions throughout the body that will slow down in order to prevent wasting away and dying, essentially. That's not really the environment in which we live now, but our genetics and metabolism hasn't exponentially changed in the last 200 years. Our environment has, and we're still trying to sort of offset that. With regards to how that works in a metabolic context, we'll have lots of food available, metabolism will increase, our food storage will our storage of energy will increase, so fat cells increase, things like your muscle stimulus will increase. So we'll put on muscle, we'll put on a whole heap of things in order to conserve and hold on to that energy. Then when that energy is not available, that food supply is not available, our metabolism decreases and it initiates processes in the body in order to get you to stop burning so much energy. So lots of little things like when you're in an energy deficit or when there's not enough food available to maintain that energy level, your brain initiates little mechanisms to stop you burning so much. So who's ever been in a diet and felt not like doing very much?
Right.
You make every
time, right?
Every excuse in the world to sit on the couch and watch 2 hours of TV or 4 hours or 6 hours, where when you're in an energy surplus, generally people won't do that. They'll move around. So you inadvertently end up burning a lot more incidental activity or incidental energy through incidental activity. So that energy conservation comes with your body, and it's lots of little things, like you'll get little thoughts in your head when you're in an energy deficit, like, oh, this is hard. Stop working so hard. Oh, I'm tired. My alarm's gone off at 4 o'clock in the morning. Oh, I'm too tired. This is so comfy in bed. I don't want to get out of bed. So that's what I meant when it's hard to tease out the difference between physiological and psychological, because they're interrelated. You can't always stop those psychological things happening when they're influenced by the physiology.
Right. So the physiological response is to cause psychological responses as well.
Absolutely, which is sometimes what sets people up with the being in that chronic diet and then binging.
Holy shit! Because you just get so the common thing you get told is, well, it's a willpower is usually the thing given to you, but your body's working against you in that regard, right?
Willpower definitely comes into it, but there is a very big physiological aspect of it. So just the mechanism of dieting itself will initiate your body's need to get energy back, which influences your psychology.
Right.
So sometimes you have to have, like, willpower is something that's flexible. You'll find in different points of your life, your ability to say yes and no to things are different. So when you're in a diet, put it into reference, when you're in a really aggressive diet, your willpower and ability to say no to a piece of chocolate may be a lot different to say, we're all sitting here now, we're all pretty well fed, have breakfast. If someone put a chocolate on the table, it's not really that appetizing. Or your willpower to say no to that right now might be pretty good. So willpower is something that's flexible based on physiology.
So thinking about with coming back to the that supercompensation effect.
Training side, yeah. Sorry, we just went on one of those rabbit holes. Yeah, go
on. So the main effect that's happening there is the glycogen uptake, the capacity for glycogen uptake. That's correct?
Yeah, glycogen uptake and glycogen storage.
So if we said you had multiple responses, so after you're in a chronic diet stage where we both want to put on, we're more hypersensitive to putting on body mass, body fat, store more glycogen. So when we're doing the refeed and you're focusing more on the carbohydrate side of things, is that trying to negate the effect of the fat gain from fat, or is it just...
Not really. So what we sort of talked about is kind of relevant to this whole process. So what happens with the nature of dieting is you do see metabolic suppression. With that refeeding, it's not about going back to maintenance, because that maintenance level it doesn't exist. That maintenance level is fluctuating, and because your metabolism isn't stock standard, it isn't the same all the time. That fluctuates. There's no way to determine where that maintenance is. So with that hypercompensation effect and that refeeding effect, what we're trying to do is we're trying to refeed metabolism back to its high level. So you'll see with dieting metabolic suppression, with that refeeding, we want to return that metabolism back to what that high levels are, or even higher than before, because if we're increasing lean mass, your metabolic rate is going to be higher because there's more metabolic tissue. So we can't go back to a huge amount of food straight away, because that huge amount of food straight away from being in a diet essentially tells your body, oh, we're in feast, store, because we've been in famine before. So you hold on to more mass. So we need to increase a little bit. And how we increase that is not just as simple as how many calories we're increasing. We also need to look at it in reference to what your training stimulus is like what your body's burning, as well as what your metabolic stimulus is like. So your carbohydrates are one way in which we see that metabolic return back, because it's your carbohydrate metabolism is sort of, I call it the center of your metabolic universe. It's your Krebs cycle, TCA cycle, whatever you want to call it, is sort of at the center of your metabolism, and that will slow down as your carbohydrate intake will slow down, which will have a variety of metabolic responses outside of that. So you think about it like a big wheel in the center of metabolic cogwheel machinery. There are a multitude of different chemicals that shoot off that are going to affect a multitude of other metabolic processes. So it's like a cascading effect. So if we're slowing that down, it's going to result in a whole heap of other metabolic processes slowing down, which results in an overall metabolic suppression. So we want to see an increase in that metabolism. With that process, we also need to create some storage of carbohydrates in the muscles themselves, because if we have, if we're looking at strength training specifically, you're predominantly using your glycolytic systems and your phosphate creatine system. Phosphate creatine we modify through meat consumption, and if you're taking creatine, that's not really affected so much in this context. So it's predominantly looking at your glycolytic systems, which are how much carbohydrates or glycogen, if you will, are stored within the muscle bellies themselves. If you're looking with long-term dieting, you'll have that metabolic suppression, and then your body says, refeed. We've got all these extra food available. If we're consuming extra carbohydrates, we want to be able to store as much as we can into that muscle to peak that performance. But it's also being used to increase those metabolic machinery, or those metabolic cogwheels, to increase your metabolism. So we need to ensure that we've got enough of both processes happening.
So what's the direct application behind this theory then? So what you're saying is, obviously the carbs are low while you're in the cutting phase. Are you talking about tapering them when you're in the refeed?
Yeah, when we refeed, we taper them back up.
Right. Okay.
So what responses are you looking for? Just is it a maintenance of weight, or like their, I guess, biofeedback and how they're feeling? And so what responses are you looking for to know that you can keep
feeding?
Keep feeding.
Physiologically, how they're feeling.
Right. Okay.
As well as what their weight's doing. In order to see a change in glycogen levels within the body itself, you need to see a change in overall weight, because when you store glycogen within the muscle, you also store water within the muscle. So it's how they're feeling physiologically, how they're looking. So you'll see with, strength-based athletes, they generally have a fair whack of muscle on their frame. Leading into a refeed, they'll start looking a lot flatter, and they'll often say, I'm feeling small, I'm feeling small. Which is...
Sorry, this is funny because you said those exact words to me, because you were recently on I presume you were going through this process, right? And he was in there, and he was like, I'm down to X amount of calories. He was freaking out because he was like, I'm not happy that I feel small.
It's like a phase. It's like a phase. There's like a phase that you start dieting. You haven't lost any fat yet, but your muscles feels like they start to shrink. It's like, so now I just feel like I'm just fatter now.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I predominantly work with aesthetic athletes and strength athletes. So when we're looking with aesthetic athletes, because they have such a higher focus on how they look,
of course,
I will know when someone needs a refeed, because they will say to me, I'm feeling really shit. I'm feeling really small, and they'll start getting in their head about it.
Freaking out.
Start freaking out. And, like 12 hours into a refeed, they're like, oh, I'm swole now. And you see a muscle pump effect, because the muscles fill up, and with, how someone aesthetically looks, it's not always about how much muscle on their frame, as well as, how pumped the muscles are. So everyone always feels better after they've, gone and done a gym session and a pump session. How many guys go out on a Friday night, do a quick chest pump session at the gym before heading out into the town?
Yeah.
It's that offset of, getting that pump within the muscle, which you see with the glycogen replenishment, as well as it happening with the water storing in there too.
So what happens? There's that time you said, like we had a bit of a refeed, and then I end up dropping weight, even though we added 400 grams of extra carbs into the diet. So there's obviously it's counterintuitive, calories up, weight down.
Right. Yeah.
What's happening there?
Logically, it doesn't sound like it makes sense, but this comes back to metabolism is dynamic. That I never usually give someone a one-day refeed. It's always multiple days in a row, because what we often find, depending on the size of the athlete, some athletes we can get glycogen saturation within 12 to 24 hours. Some people it takes 96 hours with, and that's dependent on a variety of different factors, including, the genetics of that athlete, the muscle within their frame itself, the stimulus, environmental stimulus and whatnot. When we're looking at refeeding, if we're talking about, like a strength-based athlete, someone with a decent whack on their frame, within that first 12 to 24 hours, we're only seeing a change in that metabolic response. So think about it back to when I was talking about the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle being the center of your metabolic universe. We're feeding into that. So that machinery has slowed down and turned down, which has slowed down a whole heap of other metabolic processes. So with metabolism, when you're in an energy deficit, a long-term chronic energy deficit, your body essentially says, we're only going to prioritize the metabolic processes that are responsible for immediate survival. Everything else outside of that, we're going to slow down a little bit because it's not that important. So things like, for example, if there's not enough food in your environment, the priority of making offspring is not that great. So hormone production will dampen natural hormone production. So think about in regards to a strength-based athlete, how important things like your hormones are in regards to recovery and growth. They contribute something massively. It's why we have, like a lot of exogenous hormone supplementation in order to modify these things. If we're having a natural decrease in that process because your body says, oh, there's not enough food in my environment to survive, it's probably not a good idea to make babies because we're just going to have to feed them as well. So your hormones will start to decrease. And people will often see this as a symptomatic response. It's really easy in women to see because they will get stuff like a loss of menses. Yep. In men, it's not as simple because you don't get this really inconvenient monthly cycle that shows whether or not your hormones has decreased. It usually results in things like your sex drive has changed. So women see this as well, but sex drive is something that, has a lot of environmental impacts to it as well. So your interest in sex will change through bulking. Men will probably feel like it's of high interest through the back end of a diet. They'll often say, it's not even in any context of my mind, I'm just too tired, which is personality-wise probably not normal for them. This is, a generalization. But when we're looking at reverse dieting, natural hormones decrease. This is just one metabolic process, for example. Within that first sort of refeed, you start seeing a change in stuff like that. So it's almost instantaneous with men. Within a couple of days, they're like, my sex drive is back, or my sex drive has changed heaps within that first couple of days. When we're looking at carbohydrate refeeding, it's not as simple as going, oh, we're getting more carbs, we're going to put it straight into the muscle. It's going to start feeding into those metabolic processes such as hormone production that have suppressed over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, so it's not all of that energy that's accounted for with the general calorific equation isn't going to all the normal places it would, which is why you're seeing a net loss.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Why we're seeing a net loss. There is also another factor. Because the
Krebs cycle and those cycles are working harder.
Correct. There is also another factor that happens because you've been in an energy deficit. The metabolic enzymes throughout that Krebs cycle, for example, have upregulated because there's been less carbohydrate. So it needs to be more efficient at doing that. So that when you reintroduce those carbohydrates, you've got basically increased metabolic machinery efficiency. So things will run through and churn through really, really quickly. Another thing that happens as well, when you've been in an energy deficit, I talked earlier on before about you get really tired and you get all these little thoughts in your head saying, stop working so hard. Oh, this is hard. Everything's tired. You start to get a little bit of extra food, and everyone's done this. What happens when you give lollies to a small child? They go nuts. Carbohydrates, when you've been in a carbohydrate deficit environment, it creates a sort of neurological response where it sends a pulse to your brain that says, we've got high performance fuels coming. When we've previously had all this feedback to our brain that has said, we don't have a lot of fuel available. So if you're suddenly getting all these messages to your brain that said, you've got more fuel, you can work harder, people inadvertently end up burning more energy because they're moving around a hell of a lot more, because they're like, oh, I've got all this energy. I'm going to go wash the car. I'm going to vacuum the house. I'm going to do all this washing that's been building up for the last 3 weeks because I've just not wanted to deal with that and I'm too tired.
Those 5 days you fed me, that was the best 5 days of training I had, I don't know, almost ever.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I've ever done 275 for like 3 triples and the deadlift. Is that what, 210 for triple on the bench? Felt like I had like another 3 more in me.
Wow.
And the speed on my squat, I couldn't do reps on my squat because I had hip pain, but I had to end up like doing like 330 squat, and it was just like, I had like 330 on my back, and I felt like, man, I got like 380 here today.
Yeah.
You know, and just in those days. So it's a mixture of psychology and physiology happening there, isn't there?
Absolutely. So there's that extra glycogen load that happens, that extra fuel available, but it also comes down to that neurological effect of that feedback within your brain saying, we've got fuel available, we've got lots of fuel. So that's one of the reasons why within sports performance themselves, we target carbohydrates during exercise in order to create that feedback. So inadvertently, when you exercise, you get feedback to your brain that says we're running out of fuel. So it's not necessarily we're running out of fuel in the muscle, it's your blood sugar levels are starting to run out of fuel. And within your brain itself, your brain is captain of the ship. It is priority, number one, survival of your brain. It doesn't care that you want to put muscle on or do all these other things. It wants to survive. So if its fuel source is running out because it doesn't have a storage shelf of fuel, its fuel cell is your blood sugar levels. As they start to decrease, it will send feedback to your brain to start influencing your actions so that you stop doing the things that's contributing to its fuel source decreasing, aka your blood sugar levels dropping. So as you start exercising and continue through that exercise, your blood sugar levels will drop. You'll get feedback to your brain and you'll start getting all those little stray thoughts in your head going, oh, this is hard. This is really heavy. Oh my God, what am I doing? Oh my God, this is painful. All those little things that impact performance. It's like when we introduce the carbohydrates, we create this little pulse in your tongue that switches off that feedback loop. And that little pulse says, we've got fuel available, come and keep working harder. So it sort of interrupts those stray little thoughts, which you think about it, having those carbohydrates and having that refuel is like having your own little personal trainer inside your head the whole time going, you can do this, you can work harder, you can lift harder, which combine that with I've actually physiologically got the fuel available in the muscles themselves and a hypercompensation of those fuels because we've been able to store more because of that secondary metabolic hypercompensation effect with storing glycogen. It means performance increases drastically because you've got the psychological aspect of it and you've got the physiological aspect of it.
Your brain's literally talking to you to survive.
Yeah.
Or use more. It's like, oh, we got energy now, so you better go do some work.
Totally. That's exactly what happens.
Well, obviously, when it comes to elite powerlifting, at the higher end, psychologically, it plays, it's just a massive role in it, right? Whether you think you can lift said weight, it plays a massive role. So that's a huge advantage to have, isn't it? Especially the more elite you get, that matters more.
Every
right?
time we've had strength coaches and athletes on, and it's like the conversation always ends up being psychology. There's so much psychology behind it, and it's always like the limiting factor whether someone's going to make it or not.
Yep.
Because of their own internal dialogue and the way they approach and their willpower and whatever. Actually, I had another question with that hyper compensation or that hyper or super compensation. Is that or with the hyperglycogen load, would that be the same with ATP storages?
Not necessarily. ATP it's a bit more complicated because how much ATP that you have, there's a sort of negative feedback loop. So it's also a ratio between ATP and ADP. So ATP is an adenosine triphosphate, which is an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates on it. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, which is 2 molecules on it. So the phosphates attached to the adenosine molecule are a highly reactive energy compound. So the way that energy works is you have an ATP molecule. When a phosphate molecule snaps off, it creates a big energy transference shift, which if you, say, for example, put that on a muscle fibre, you transfer a whole heap of energy for that phosphate snapping off. It creates contraction of that muscle fibre, which is responsible for, like movement, right? In order to increase ATP levels, it's relevant to the feedback of how many ADPs are left. So like that energy transference shift has to happen in order for that ADP. So when there are high levels of ADP, your body will get feedback to say put ADP through the electron transport chain to spit out ADP, so to reattach that phosphate to create that high energy molecule. If we have high levels of ATP in the system, it creates that negative feedback loop that says to the electron transport chain to switch that machinery off, so you stop producing ATP.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So it's something that's really, really highly regulated. The only thing we can't really modify ATP in itself because there's so many metabolic processes that regulate how much we have, and it's relevant to how much we've used. So when we've used a lot of ATP, we send a feedback loop that says we need more ATP. When we've got too much ATP, we send a feedback loop that says switch off ATP production. When we're talking about strength training, we are looking at different energy systems that we're trying to modify. And creatine phosphate is one of those methods, because creatine phosphate sort of works similarly to ATP in regards to that phosphate, when it breaks off creatine, creates a highly reactive energy molecule, energy transference. We can modify creatine levels within the body to a certain amount, but over that, our body just sort of dumps it. So we can create a little bit of saturation, but only to a certain extent. It's not an infinite supply. Otherwise, we end up with a chemical distribution issue.
Can it be part of would you say it's part of a training supercompensation effect? If you're like training, because generally when I'm training people, I'm holding that volume for as long as I can, for generally, and then back off for a predicted amount of time depending on the individual, what I think their recovery is going to be to the point of the competition. So that's what I'm doing when I'm working with coaches. Some people take longer to recover, some people take a lot shorter. So I'll hold that volume as long as I can, hold that fatigue as long as I can, and then they get that compensation affected.
That's a really complicated question. That's
nuance.
That's beyond just ATP. So we're looking at basically like fitness levels sort of in general. So when you're looking at recovery within that small window, you're looking at your oxidative systems as well as your non-oxidative systems. So your phosphate, creatine, and non-oxidative. Oxidative are things like your endurance fibers. So a lot of that is determined on baseline physiology. So if you're someone that has a high distribution of your type 2 muscle fibers, you're going to have a higher population of creatine phosphate, because type 2 muscle fibers predominantly use creatine phosphate and glycolytic systems, so glycolysis, which half of that is non-oxidative, the other half is oxidative, requires oxygen in order to produce that. So the areas of energy that or energy production in the oxidative system as well as the non-oxidative system, they're all gateway controlled by metabolic enzymes. Those metabolic enzymes we can modify. We can't modify the ATP. ATP is the end currency of it. These are all the working chemicals that result in currency. We can modify these working chemicals, and we can also modify the enzymes that catalyze these. With dieting, for example, we can modify the enzymes that catalyze these, because you've been in an undernourished environment. It will create more of these enzymes to catalyze these, because you need to be better at dealing with them, or better at dealing with less of these. So if we have less of one chemical, the enzymes, they don't just like in the body work as a magnet towards it. They've got to randomly bounce around until they hit it. So we need to increase those random bouncing moments to create that catalyst effect, which results in metabolic enzymes of, say, for example, the non-oxidative process of glycolysis, the first breakdown of carbohydrates. That process then goes into an oxidative process, the TCA cycle. We can increase those enzymes through stimulus, through creating a break in the oxidative system, because it goes through multiple different phases. It goes through a non-oxidative system, then an oxidative system. So we can modify that with holding on, that like we were just speaking about, or we can modify that with nutrition itself. So you can create a sense of fitness and recovery in there, because the quicker it goes through that, the quicker it can then recover from it as well. With holding on, it's a hard process to say we can modify so much with it. Some people naturally, genetically have a certain base point. So if we look at things like VO2 max, it's determined by baseline genetics, and we can modify it to a percentage, but no more than that. So say, for example, two different bodies, even put under the same stimulus, like I could train as much as I want, I'm never going to get to the lifting capacity that you would, Gus, because we have very different baseline genetics. And similarly, if you decided one day, I don't know, you bumped your head and decided to be a marathon runner,
you have to be a significant bump. Gus hates cardio.
Yeah. You're probably not going to be winning any marathons, because you don't have the baseline physiology. When I'm talking about that, I'm talking about muscle fiber distribution. You don't have a high distribution of your type 1 endurance-based fibers that are responsible for those sort of sport events to create it. So even if we did as much training as we wanted and we hired the best marathon coach in the world, you're still not going to win marathons. Sorry, mate.
You know, I used to do triathlon.
Sure. Really?
When I was about 77 kilos.
Yeah, you were a different human, I guess.
Yeah, very different. I just swayed very far to the other way.
Do you I don't know if this is applicable to this. Maybe it is. Do you see a benefit in general aerobic capacity and training when it comes to strength athletes and these systems? Do you think, because you're of the school of thought that Gus, that cardio is kind of like a useless surplus that takes away from the training you need to do, right?
What's I would keep baseline.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, how important is that baseline? And I'm just thinking in terms of recovery as well, between sets and stuff. At what point does that start making a difference for you?
It depends on what you're training for.
Right. Yeah, I was finding it hard to answer your question, because
it's a bad question, to be fair.
It depends who I'm working with, what their goals are, and what phase in training we're in, and you know, their work capacity. So some people people can do more work,
and that comes down to their physiology and their muscle fiber distribution on a genetic level. Yeah.
So you know, I'll keep a very baseline, like just walking. I might push the prowler or something like twice a week or something, you know. But you know,
outrageous.
It's exhausting enough doing the training that I'm doing anyway.
This is it. Do you ever get clients come through and you take one look at them and you're like, yeah, this ain't your sport, mate? Like, do you ever? I mean, obviously you would say it in those words, but are there any people, obviously, and you're always going to help everybody improve because that's your job, but are there some people with unrealistic expectations versus their physiology?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or is that just, have I just described everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We'll have client inquiries all the time. That'll be from the range of, I'm a 60 kilo male and I want to put on 20 kilos of lean mass naturally in 6 weeks. Like, mate, this isn't achievable in 6 years. Like,
I did in YouTube set a clip.
And then we have on the other context, like I had an inquiry the other day that was a gentleman who was 150 kilos and wanted to lose 80 kilos in 3 months.
Jesus.
Yeah, which is also unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, holy shit.
So, yeah.
I don't even know what the extreme is, even if that's even...
I sent back a reply to him with, let's just do some math, and it's not even possible. I think that with the numbers that we worked out, he'd have to be in a 6,000 calorie a day deficit in order to achieve that result, which is not possible. Most people wouldn't even be on a diet of that. So he potentially may, if it's 150 kilos, be eating 6,000 calories a day, but essentially he'd have to be on 0 calories a day, and metabolic suppression wouldn't be a thing. If metabolism did not adapt, that may be possible, but he'd be very malnourished and undernourished, not literally eating anything but water.
What was so important? He had to lose 80 kilos in 3 months.
I don't know.
I think
people just have unrealistic expectations. They watch shows like The Biggest Loser and think that that's a thing that.
I can go. I could.
We used to
want to go down a rabbit hole?
We used to watch so many.
I think that show.
We used to watch so. Actually, I used to train Margie Cummings. She won one of the biggest losers, and
I remember her. So I remember watching that, and I can't remember at what point I was watching it. It was maybe halfway through where something twigged in my brain that they're just torturing mentally ill people for entertainment. Like, it's
nothing. So I've heard it all from her. There is nothing realistic about what they're doing on that show. Nothing real. Their weight loss over a week is not a week. It's over months. Before they even weigh in, they're getting as fat as they can. They're doing water cuts, extreme water cuts. Like, she had like some MMA coach come out to teach her how to drop like 12, 13, 14 kilos in water alone just for her final weigh-in.
I mean, I get that, because
after
there's
already
financial return based on your weight on the scales and nothing else. Like, just fuck your health.
It was brutal, and the actual hosts there aren't there. The apparently dietitian designed diets that are on the website
are not what they follow.
Is not what they're following at all. Much less.
That doesn't shock me.
Yeah.
There was one time where I remember there was at one point where I was like, "God, I'm uncomfortable watching this." There was and this is way off in a wormhole, by the way, so sorry for anybody who doesn't give a shit, but they locked them in a room for a time period, right? In a room full of fucking Tim Tams and stuff, and they were about 6 weeks into pretty much starvation, right? And they threw him in this room, and they basically said, you get a bonus if you manage to not eat anything. And you're watching these people who are chronically obese and have been for most of their lives, right? So they're psychologically damaged people, right? And they're literally, like, it's torture for them. It's torture for them. They're just walking around. And I'm like...
Physiologically, that actually is torture. like we were speaking before about... You put people in an undernourished environment and then suddenly create all this really energy-rich food, and that's part and parcel with the issue of our society today. In a hunters and gatherers and lifestyle, the energy-rich food is a cow running past. Now it's a triple cheeseburger, which is anything that's high in carbs, high in fat, high in energy. Your body, your brain gets these messages of this is the quickest and easiest way to replenish this fuel. That equates to your body going, I need this now, and cravings.
My wife's torturing me at the moment. I'm just like, I'm like starting to get freaking hungry now. And she decided just to have a day off and last night had like Frere Rocher and a bottle of rosé, and she made like a creamy pasta. I had peas, potato, fish.
Oh, no. Wait, so there's something interesting from that, and something that's not, I don't think, commonly explained well, is the effects of alcohol. I think when people are going through these bulks, cuts, all this stuff, and people are not talking to someone like yourself who knows what they're talking about, they're just kind of working it out, and they're going off calorific balance, right? What is the effect of alcohol on all of these processes? Is this, so you say she had a bottle of rosé. Is this something that you recommend from the athlete side, they just never touch alcohol? I mean, I know the ideal would be that, but...
If we have athletes in competition, it's a zero consumption of alcohol. most of the athletes that I work with, I work with in a long-term basis. Like we've had them on board for 12 months, 2 years, 3 years. Some athletes I've been working with for 4 years. So it's been long-term. And the majority of those athletes, alcohol, part and parcel of the Australian culture. It's really hard to completely avoid. But most of them are pretty serious athletes, and the only time that they'll really drink is once or twice a year at celebration. And it's relatively pretty responsible. Every now and then we have someone who has a vendor, but as in part and parcel of being an adult in Australia, I guess. But during competition, absolutely not. The reason for that is alcohol. It is poison. It is literally poison. We have no nutritional need to drink alcohol. So if you're consuming something that's poison, people don't like to think about this stuff because it's uncomfortable and it doesn't sit nicely with, oh, alcohol is a fun way to socialize and it makes me feel good. Yeah. So people just put the blinders up and go, I don't want to think about this stuff. I'm going to talk about it because it doesn't affect me in any way, shape or form. Alcohol's poison. We put poison in our body has a response from that. So one of the responses is, if you put poison in your body wants to get rid of that straight away. So it puts all of its focus on trying to get rid of that. When it comes to the human body, we metabolize everything that we consume through the liver. So when we eat something, it goes through the hepatic blood network everything goes into the liver processes it up, processes it out to different areas of the body. So you're consuming alcohol, it all gets metabolized in the liver, and it gets metabolized in a certain inner ring of your hepatocytes. If you're introducing into that food at the same time, your body says, number one priority, get rid of the toxin. You're consuming food and it says, oh, not as important as getting rid of this toxin. So it doesn't necessarily shuttle off the food that you're consuming or the nutrients that you're consuming to the right areas, which sometimes that results in, we're just going to put it in storage right here. So this is one of the reasons why when you see people who are chronic alcoholics or not even chronic alcoholics, the average, let's just say the average 40-year-old man, what is their general body shape look like?
Right, so we're talking about the pot belly.
Pot belly, yeah. It's a pot belly because they consume alcohol, food. The food gets put into energy reserves. Energy reserves doesn't have time to shuttle it off into nice little packages across the body. I'm just going to drop it next door, which results in central adiposity, which is basically fat storage cells within the liver area itself and within the abdominal area, because it's less energy demanding when it's your body's trying to process getting rid of all the toxins within your body itself.
Right. Okay. So this is where the fact that it significantly inhibits recovery comes in, right? Like, yeah,
it inhibits a multitude of different process because alcohol inhibits recovery in a variety of different things. One, when you drink alcohol, people think, oh, I'm not going to eat food with it, because when I've explained this to clients, they're like, this means that I just don't eat when I drink.
Everyone's just trying to find a way out of it.
There's not a loophole for this, people.
Right, you can't just get blasted and not eat.
Yeah, you can't get blasted and not eat. So alcohol stays in your system for a substantial amount of time after you're drinking. So it's not just about what you're consuming while you're actually drinking. It's what you're doing in the 24 hours to 48 hours afterwards. It's still taking that long to detoxify all this stuff out of your system. So with that, you end up with a whole bunch of toxins. So I'm not sure if people know much about how alcohol's detoxified, but it's just essentially detoxified within a two-stage process. And there's an enzyme in the middle of that two-stage process, which is a rate-limiting enzyme. The first phase is faster than the second phase, which means you get a buildup of inflammatory, horrible chemicals in the middle, while the second phase takes a bit slower to detoxify the alcohol completely out of your system. That middle phase of chemicals is where all your oxidative damage happens, so where all the destructive stuff happens within your body. Oxidative damage for the athlete is not a good idea. Oxidative damage for anyone in general is not a good idea. We focus a vast majority of life in preventing this, or vast majority in the research in preventing oxidative damage, because we know oxidative damage is associated with things like cancers, destruction of your DNA, telomeres, things like that. So it basically means bad shit's going to happen if you have too much oxidation, and we get oxidation from a multitude of different things within the environment. So pollutants, toxins, the food we eat. Alcohol is a massive one. So with regards to recovery, we still have a lot of these middle intermediary chemicals floating around for the next 24 to 48 hours, which are causing oxidative damage. When you exercise itself, it causes a metabolic response that creates oxidative damage localized within the muscle, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's that oxidative damage localized within the muscle cell that is what signals feedback to repair. So this means like little micro tears in the muscle causes a bit of damage. Sometimes there's a little bit of oxidative damage, signals repair signals growth. So we need a little bit of damage within the muscle itself in order to grow, that stimulus. We create too much of that oxidative damage. So if you create a little bit of a stimulus to create some damage and then have a whole heap of oxidative chemicals, essentially you can blow that muscle fiber up. So what I've seen in athletes, I'm not sure if anyone has heard of rhabdomyolysis before.
No.
Oh, this is a fun one.
Right.
So
Awesome.
Rhabdomyolysis is essentially where it's not really studied so much in an athlete context. We see it in a hospital clinic setting where you have people with crush injuries. So if people have been in a car accident, for example, and their muscle fibers have been smushed to pieces from a crush injury, or someone's been crushed by something, the muscle fibers just go boom and get smushed. That results in a whole bunch of the stuff inside of the cell being not inside of the cell anymore, so it's outside of the cell, which you then end up with a whole heap of chemicals that are big and sticky and get stuck in your little nephrons in your kidneys and can cause kidney damage. So what that results in, a whole heap of muscle fiber, in layman terms, a muscle fiber damage. And then because that muscle fiber damage has a whole heap of big chemicals floating around, your little nephrons in your kidneys get destroyed and it causes kidney damage. Symptomatically, what this looks like is you get a whole heap of fluid everywhere across your body and your kidneys stop working because you've destroyed your kidneys. This is really common in athletes, because if you have people going through, really, especially with strength trained athletes, people who do muscle injuries and they get too much muscle damage, it can create too much stress on the kidneys and create a form of kidney failure. We find this in athletes who, like I know two, I can say that clients have come to me who have had rhabdomyolysis from one from a coach who absolutely flogged their client, who created rhabdomyolysis, and another one from a client who had a 3-day long bender and then went and tried and offset that 3-day long bender with way too much training.
Right, so, and that second example is a common one, right, where you try to balance it out by overtraining on the other end, and people do it generally with diet all the time, right?
Yeah.
So no, go on. This is fascinating.
What are the symptoms of was it again?
Rhabdomyolysis.
Yeah.
People just call it rhabdo.
Rhabdo.
Yep.
What are the symptoms? I'm trying to think of. I don't know.
I'm doing it as well. I heard it.
So fluid retention. So a lot of fluid retention, as in they'll start getting like swelling through extremities, through limbs. Sometimes it can result in a change in urine output. So sometimes your pee can be a different colour. Sometimes it can be red. Sometimes it can be a sticky colour. Sometimes it can change with your urine output, can go from a shitload of wee to then not very much, and then your fluid builds up across your body.
I've had it.
So I've actually heard of this. I've heard of the symptoms. I don't know if it's been referred to as this a lot in CrossFit athletes, because they do unbelievable amounts at the highest level. They do unbelievable amounts of volume.
Yep.
And the concept behind CrossFit is just do it till you're fucking dead, right?
It's very common with CrossFit. That athlete that I mentioned was a CrossFit athlete that went on a bender and then did a stupid CrossFit, couple of WODs across the day to offset it.
Wow.
Because it's high intensity, really smash sort of food, smash activity. Just to forewarn, if you think you have rhabdo, you need to go to the hospital and get your blood filtered so it doesn't cause irreversible kidney damage.
So I think I had it during a bodybuilding prep.
Yeah.
And
I can imagine bodybuilding because of the volume side.
Yeah, so I did my own prep, and then someone wanted to help me with that final week that they call peak week, and did a bunch of stuff that I wasn't overly comfortable with, but I did it,
as everyone does.
Yeah.
Bodybuilding.
Yeah. Anyway, he had me taking diuretics, and he had crazy fluctuations in the food. So it was like on the day, and I ended up peeing, was like red, on the day, and then the next day, my hands were like completely swollen.
Yeah.
So because after he did that, there was zero monitoring on what I was doing. I had not known at that stage. I was like, this is like nearly 10 years ago.
Yeah.
On what was happening. I just like, I'll just trust this person to.
That stuff's still happening today. I wish I could say I haven't heard that story before, but I have.
Yeah. Didn't realize how bad. Didn't realize obviously now how bad.
So are you? Do we think Gus has got compromised kidneys because of this? Is this how irreversible is irreversible?
Kidneys are a bit a hard one.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't. Kidneys are really good at compensating. So, say for example, if you had a kidney removed, your other kidney picks up function and will filter. It's only until production gets to a point where it's really bad that it stops filtering. So the way that we test it is your EGFR rate, which anything above 90 is considered good. Anything below 90 is, your kidneys aren't working. And by that stage, it's too late. So there's not like a range of, you're getting close to it. It just says above 90 or not.
Right. So there's no...
So you're not going to know until you're old, essentially, or you have rhabdo a couple more times. Just try not to get rhabdo anymore.
I haven't had it since.
Oh, Jesus.
Your kidneys are good at compensating. So, yeah, for some people it doesn't repair, but with kidneys, once the damage is done, they don't repair. They can just compensate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand.
Is this the same as what you coined as the refeed syndrome?
No, refeed syndrome and rhabdo completely two different things. Symptoms are sort of similar, except refeeding syndrome can result in heart attacks, which is slightly different.
Yeah, wow.
That's
ouch.
immediate death sometimes.
Okay. Worth it.
So things like rhabdo and refeeding syndrome are things we watch out when people are chronically dieting as well. Rhabdos, you're more vulnerable to it when you're in a diet because you're in an undernourished environment and you don't have the capacity to recover and repair as well. So it's that progressive load. So if you have someone through who are, flogging a dead horse by the end of your training session, which is why I'm always on about when clients are getting to the point of needing to have deloads so that they're not... Gus is laughing because I was on his case a few weeks ago. So that constant load with strength training, we know it takes anywhere from 48 hours to 92 hours to completely recover, which with strength training, you're always going into another session before that recovery is completely finished. So you're constantly creating tears. So it's that progressive constant tear, and then you're coupling that with not having the nutrition there to be able to repair all of that damage, making sure that we then don't go through a really, really heavy load and put ourselves at a really vulnerable risk of rhabdo becomes really important. So we monitor pretty closely, like when I have people through aggressive diets towards the sort of back end, we do check-ins pretty closely because I'm monitoring for these things and making sure that we're not at risk of damaging their bodies irreparably, because it is at these sort of extreme end of sports, you can do some damage to the body. And the unfortunate thing is, as a lot of practitioners who put clients through this are just unaware of the damage. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you don't know what you don't know. I know probably not enough, but enough to know that I still know enough, where we still need to monitor for these things. With regards to refeeding syndrome, this is something that we see a lot in bodybuilding industry, because people go through really long chronic diets. I'm talking anywhere from 20 weeks to 40 weeks, depending on body fat composition, where they can essentially put them at really high risk. Refeeding syndrome is something that is not studied in athlete context. I only see it in athlete context because I've seen it multiple times before. We learn it in a clinical context as a dietitian in a hospital setting. So if we have a patient come into a hospital who's been really malnourished or undernourished, the first thing that they do before we give them any food, before we give them any water, is we need to assess them for malnourishment. And there's a grade in which they're assessed for how malnourished they are. And that determines how we actually feed them. Because if you take someone who's been really, really undernourished, and we talked about this with the hypercompensation effect, when you reintroduce food, you've got a hypercompensation effect in order to deal with it. So you take someone who's essentially not been eating, this isn't a hospital context, mind you, and then we give them a whole heap of food. They've got all these metabolic process that says, oh, I've been starving, eat lots of high calorie food. They've had all this increased metabolic response to deal with it. What that results in is a bit of metabolic aberration. So one of the things that alters during that chronic dieting is the way that you allow glucose within the cell itself. So that is the number of receptors, number of carbohydrate receptors on the cell surface, as well as your insulin production. So as you go through a diet, you become more insulin sensitive. Insulin is responsible for allowing glucose outside of the cell or from the blood into the cell itself, where metabolic action happens. So this is why we know with obese people who have carbohydrate issues, glucose sensitivity issues, putting them through a diet metabolically, they get a good response, because chronic dieting results in increased carbohydrate response through increasing sensitivity to insulin. If you then have a really high sensitivity to insulin and then introduce too much carbohydrates too quickly, what happens is you get a really, really high spike in carbohydrates within the blood cells, blood itself. So your blood sugar levels elevate. Your blood sugar levels have a feedback loop. They're not supposed to be too high in the bloodstream, or it results in some bad stuff happening. So when they reach a certain level, the gateways or to your cells themselves open up to allow that carbohydrate into the cells themselves. So that can result in storage of the carbohydrate within the liver, the glycogen storage, which is your major storage, or storage of your carbohydrate as glycogen in the muscle, or storage of carbohydrate within the fat cells themselves. So we're trying to get rid of it out of the bloodstream, and we're trying to shuffle it into storage. Because we have an increased capacity and we have a huge big carbohydrate load, if someone's eaten, a bucket load of carbohydrates really quickly, what that results in is all the gateways opening up. So if you think about it like a dam, we've just broken the wall of a dam down and water's going to come gushing out. With carbohydrates, we've opened up the cell surface to allow insulin in, but it's created a bit of distribution issue. That often results in some of your electrolytes being a bit unbalanced within the intracellular matrix and extracellular matrix. So within the bloodstream and then within the cell surface itself, they alter. So you're supposed to maintain a ratio of your electrolytes at a certain ratio inside and outside the cell. If that alters, it can cause a localized sort of electrical pulse, if you will, which then can initiate things like cramps. So people who have gotten, for example, athletes, you'll find towards the back end of competition, they'll start getting more vulnerable for stuff like cramps. And that's because there's a electrolyte distribution issue. So oftentimes we look at things like magnesium, as magnesium is one of the salts that we lose through sweat. And it's also something that decreases, obviously, with undernourishment. Your electrolytes will end up decreasing. That electrolyte distribution issue can cause that sort of localized cramping. Localized cramping in the heart equals what? A heart attack?
Cardiac arrest, yeah.
Cardiac arrest, which is not really great. It also results in things like when you move those electrolytes in and out of the cell within sort of the wrong distribution, water always follows in order to balance the concentration. So you end up with too much water in certain areas and not enough water in certain areas. That results in essentially swelling. So refeeding syndrome, we see people start getting cramps, people start getting, similarly, like we talked about rhabdo, they start getting fluid distribution issues across their body. And they'll start getting, it might not be full-blown cramps, but it might be little flutters. So people will start getting like little flutters in their heart.
Yeah.
They'll start getting the symptoms of a high blood sugar level event when they start eating it. So this is basically immediately. They'll get a high blood sugar level event, and then that cascade will happen where you'll get all the cell surface open, carbohydrates or the blood sugar levels drop to shuffle the sugars into storage, and then you'll get a low blood sugar level event. So then you'll get the symptoms of a low blood sugar level event, which is, if anyone's had one before, it's dizzy, hearing sort of starts to go, really sweaty hands. That's the first click, and that's sort of instantaneous. So if you take someone from undernourished to then going, here's a big binge, essentially, about 10 minutes into that binge, they're like, I'm not feeling too great. And then within the next couple of hours, you'll start to see the fluid put on. When you're looking at athletes, this is really common, I see, in the bodybuilding industry. So people do their bodybuilding comp, the next day after comp, if they've gone on an outrageous binge that night, they'll be all fluidy and horrible. Or they have been told to have refeeds before leading into the comp, and it's been too much for their bodies to handle, and they've been all fluidy and horrible leading into comp. This is an aesthetic sport, like that just ends it for the day for you.
Yeah, of course.
Either or, it generally means you're not where you need to be for competition. If we're looking in a non-aesthetic sport, so like powerlifting, or even I work with a lot of fighters, MMA fighters and whatnot, fluid distribution issues and neurological issues are going to cause stress on the body, which causes performance benefits. So how comfortable do you think that you would feel getting on that platform if your body's holding more fluid than it needs to? If your nervous system is a bit shot,
Yeah.
you're not going to perform to where you need to be.
Yeah.
So it goes beyond just those aesthetic sports, and not to mention, the health consequence of you're potentially at risk of dropping dead with refeeding syndrome if it's too aggressive. So as much as it's nice to go to clients, go and have a free meal off, when you combine with you've just been in a chronic diet and you have all these physiological influences going replenish, some people don't know when to stop. Like I even know with myself, I'm not very impulsive remotely. My husband and I joke about how we need to plan to be impulsive, which is an oxymoron.
Of course.
We both have really good self-control, but I know at the back end of a comp, there's that, it's almost like this mind-body detachment where you're so undernourished that you go, I'll just have one, and then you just have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then at some point you have to get this other hand and smack it and say, stop. It's really hard to put the wheels on to stop eating, because it's almost like your physiology is taken the driver's seat and said we need to replenish. So it's not, even for the most strong-willed individuals, it's a lot harder to say no and to stop that excessive control. So
have you had cases where it's maybe like an unconscious, not completely, but I've just seen some. I've heard of just some stories, especially with one of my mates. He didn't realize he was eating. It was like chocolate marshmallows. It's like, oh, I'll just have one, and then he realized. He said that he looked back. It's like what the fuck?
Oh mate, I'll one up you there, right? I've got this story that I tell everyone, right? That just when I tell people I've got no self control when it comes to sugar and stuff, right? I've had this discussion with you. Right, I've got this story. I'm not joking. So I'd said this on another podcast as well. I was once staying when we first came to Brisbane, me and my wife, we stayed with her cousin's girlfriend at the time in their apartment, okay? And we bought 4 like chocolate puddings. We ate 2 after dinner, okay? And I'm this person where if there's one left, it's like talking to me, right? Like I can hear it whispering to me across the room. So threw it in the fridge, right? Because we're around people, normal people, and we don't want to like shock them with how much of a pig I am. I go to sleep, right? I wake up the next day, there's fucking chocolate all over the sheets. It looked like I'd murdered a chocolate person. Chocolate all over my face, right? And I was like, holy shit, what the hell happened? I'd walked, I'd gone in my sleep to the fridge, right? And we had a look at the pudding. I'd just like bear clawed it like that, clawed it out and just done that, and then fucking I know you want to talk about subconscious, like
that's a great story. That's actually a similar story to what I was going to say. Is there is actually a condition called night eating syndrome, which is unconscious or subconscious eating throughout the night. This is something that I've worked with a client before that. This client had it as a result of chronic dieting in combination with some other psychosocial stresses and stuff that were happening. When you're in a really undernourished environment, and the psychosocial stuff contributed a vast majority. So there was, I don't think, like it was all interrelated, but the chronic dieting triggered an underlying thing that was happening. But it was a similar thing where this client would wake up in the morning, and this one context I remember this client saying that they woke up with a chicken carcass on their chest.
Oh, shit.
And they said to me, I'd completely stripped the chicken carcass, all the cartilage, all the skin, and
it's delicate work.
Yeah, and the client said, like, I don't even normally like it. And
Wow.
it's actually really, really fascinating disorder that can happen with, it's a form of eating disorder that we know is worsened by chronic dieting, because there is that physiological requirement for additional food. There is a link within it. There's a pathophysiological issue with your sleep cycle. So normally what's supposed to happen during your sleep is when you dream about stuff, you've got a mechanism in your brain that switches off movement. So you don't act out your dreams. In some contexts, that mechanism doesn't switch off. So if you look at, for example, and I've been researching into this a little bit lately because I've got an 8.5-month-old baby. Babies in the first couple of months of life, that mechanism is not set in place. Yep. So they grunt and they make a lot of noise and they wiggle around and they move a lot in their sleep because they do act out their sleep. And I've got a very neurologically active child. Me too. And I almost need a straight jacket home most nights to try and get her to sleep because she moves around a lot in her sleep. And I've been trying to research when does this actually switch off, which has sort of led me into a rabbit hole of what happens with adults. And it's a really fascinating sort of context that happens with undernourishing and eating throughout the night and on a subconscious level.
I think I would have been eating through the night then if I didn't have that mechanism stopping me, because I used to have like dreams about eating when I was dieting, and then you'll be eating like a sandwich or something and you go, oh no. It's like, I'm on a diet.
I'd be a really interesting test case for you. You've probably seen it all before, but I'm a binger. Like my wife tells legends of the amount of food I can binge on. Like, it's insane. And I've got all the shit that comes with that, all the psychological issues and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that whole, I consciously do it now. Do you know what I mean? It gets to the point now, and I think there are a lot of people like this, where if you're just gonna fall off the wagon, I'm just gonna fall off hard, right? And I'm just gonna fucking go all the way. That's where I think this concept of a cheat day has come in. I think everybody loves the idea of a cheat day. Because you could do the bottle of tequila, fucking all kinds of crazy stuff.
It's a fun time. That's why everyone loves it. And I personally, I hate the term cheat day because what we find with most clients, that just about every client that comes to me with, one or two exceptions, everyone has issues with food behaviours.
Yeah.
And it's part and parcel of the society and the foodscape that we have.
Of course.
And a lot of it is also attributed to the vast, I guess, over influence of it's trendy to be healthy. So there's so much information and there's so much over information on what to eat, when to eat, what you should eat, that it all becomes way too confusing. So we have people coming to us going clean eating. I hate the term clean eating because people who clean eat, and I say that within inverted commas, are the ones that clean eat throughout the week and then binge on the weekend. And you're right, this wagon that everyone has hitched themselves to, the wagon's wrong. The wagon's completely off the rails in the first place, which is what attributes to them then falling off the wagon. So people haven't worked out what balance is. There's either this all or nothing. I've got to be really good, and really good equals me eating chicken, broccoli and rice 5-6 days a week and then going on a 10,000 calorie binge on the weekend because I'm undereat throughout the week. I'm so starved of food. I'm so bored with the food I've eaten that now I have to feel like I've got to get as much as I can in this one little window because I know next week I'm going to have to eat good again. And eating good means eating chicken, broccoli and rice. And this is really boring and it's not satisfying my physiological needs or psychological needs. So one of the things that we teach people is how to balance that out, is how to actually include those binge feeds throughout the week so that you don't get to the weekend and feel like, oh, I've got to squirrel all this up and smash it all in one go, which then puts people at risk of, one, things like refeeding syndrome, but two, the biggest thing is the psychological damage associated with it. No one feels good. Like, you feel good during the time of having a binge. Yeah, drinking a bottle of tequila, that's fun. During it, no one has ever drunk a bottle of tequila and felt great after it or the next day. It's the consequence of what happens the next day. And often people go, it's worth it at the time. Like, it's worth it to feel this good. I don't want to think about how shit I'm going to feel for the rest of the week.
I think athletes have, I don't know about you, Gus, but I think I grew up playing a lot of professional sports, but not in the strength arena. But this is like soccer in the UK. But the general consensus among athletes there is those binges are validated because they've earned it. So that
Totally.
So say your training splits, Monday to Friday, right? They almost feel like it's a valid thing to do on a Saturday because I've
legitimized it.
And it's the worst time post training or post competition is the worst time to do it, right? To hammer it in. The amount of guys, and this is common in soccer and team sports generally, right? You play a game at the weekend, and after the game, you go out and get wasted with the lads, right? To cool down, they call it, or calm down. It's like, but then it takes you 5 days to recover because you know.
That's a big issue with our society. A lot of these binge restrict binge behaviors are culturalized and they're legitimized by the nature of the culture. So like I see it, and this is one of the reasons why I went into dietetics, because what I saw in the bodybuilding industry was horrific. It's essentially an industry that is legitimized eating disorders, whether that's anorexia or whether that's binge eating disorders. And there is argument as well that certain personality types that are genetically predisposed to binge eating disorders and anorexia generally gravitate towards certain types of sport, because of the nature of perfectionism in there and because of the nature of competitiveness. So you'll have sort of that underlying influence of genetics as well as the cultural legitimizing it. So I've had clients in the bodybuilding industry contact me and say, this is what I want to do. How often do we get cheat meals? And as soon as a client says to that in an initial conversation, before I'll even book them in for initial consult, I know that their interest in this is not for the right one. They're doing the sport to legitimize a bad behavior, because, it's culturally okay to, eat 1,000 calories throughout the week and then have a 4,000 calorie refeed in inverted commas, where it's not a refeed. A refeed is structured, titrated carbohydrates, protein, fat. A cheat meal is essentially a binge on whatever you want. But I mean, that feels nice, and it's really easy to not think about these things because they're uncomfortable things to think about. And it's easy for people to go, oh, I'm doing it because this is what my sport requires. Or, in your context, this is culturally okay because this is what you do with the lads. You go and play really hard soccer throughout the week, and then on the weekend you bond and you connect together by going out and getting smashed. That's legitimizing that bad behavior and creating that bad culture. It's a really hard one to navigate and to get through.
Be complicated dealing with those clients, wouldn't it? Or
you got to.
Depends.
I guess you got to start with a therapy session, don't you? Really, it's got to be like you got to reframe, or do you just discount them as? What do you do with those people? Are there anyone where you go, red flag, can't work with you? Or...
I work with clients who have diagnosed eating disorders, and I work with clients who don't have diagnosed eating disorders. Probably about 90% of my clients, if they went to a psychologist, would have a diagnosed eating disorder.
Of course, yeah.
But a lot of, I don't know if you've looked at the schedule of fees for a psychologist, they're pretty expensive. And people also don't like to admit that. So I've done specialised training and sort of navigate that. But I stopped calling my service a nutrition consultation. And the way that I structure my service is I call it nutrition coaching. So honestly, when it comes to food is about 5%, psychology is about 95%. So I can write the best diet plan in the world, and it doesn't mean it's not worth the paper it's written on if people won't follow it. And what stops people from following a food plan is usually what's going on in their head. And that's for the vast majority. I have a very small select clientele, which are usually my top performing athletes, who would eat shit on a stick if I said it would win them a trophy. And to be honest, that clientele is really fun to deal with because that's where I get to use all my technical programming, dietetic skills, which I don't necessarily even get to use because it's pointless using all this technical programming skills if they can't even follow a basic diet for a lot of clients, or we need to sort of get them to a place where I can then get them to there where I can use my technical programming skills.
That's the same.
This is like, I was going to say, this is literally you talking here, but from a different field. It's the same thing, right?
It's just you spend so much time laying down the foundations, and at least those foundations, the psychological foundations, physiological, the way they move, is there. There's no advanced technical work, which is only put on, Well, I do have a higher amount of athletes compared to most coaches would work with, so I do have a significant amount. So probably at least half of them now I'd probably do quite advanced technical work, but yeah. In the past, it would be quite rare. Maybe you get one or two of your or three of your clients where you'd actually get to deploy advanced programming skills, because the first step is that they will need to follow a program first, and execute it well and move well and have movement quality.
Elite's elite, right? Some people just,
and it's hard with a coach as well because people's misconception, like I've changed our services. We do a minimum 6-week block with clients instead of doing, I refuse to do one-off consultations because I'll have clients come to me and go, oh, can I have a meal plan? I can write everyone a meal plan. You're not going to follow it.
Can I have a program?
We need, a minimum 6 weeks. And when I say 6 weeks, it's because if people aren't willing to invest 6 weeks, they're not willing to invest anything more, and that stops people straight away of how committed they are. Generally, 6 weeks is never enough to get someone to where they need to be. We generally need to work with someone for like 6 months to get them to where they need to be. And a one-off meal plan doesn't cut it. No one, unless you're talking about that sort of 1% of clientele who eat shit on a stick and to get a trophy, they're the only ones that I can get a meal plan to and know that they're going to follow it through. But even those clients, there are going to be things within that time frame that are going to affect their capacity to be able to eat that plan, and how we modify that plan over time is also depending on their psychology. So even with looking at yourself, looking at things like the stress and load on your body is relevant to when we're doing refeeds and when we're doing breaks, diet breaks.
Okay, now we're back.
We're back. Just about.
Okay, I forget what we were talking about before.
You were halfway through, literally it cut out halfway through you talking about Gus's application of, you said it was like with you, right? With the start a new question. We're not going to get to piece it together.
Let's go back to the topic. Okay.
We came off the topic about 45 minutes ago, I think.
So I'm still fascinated by this super compensation effect with dieting.
Yeah.
I've always listened to no one about it in terms of strength and conditioning. Do you think that affected that adaptation to, of training through a deficit is pushing that same effect of fatigue and causing the adaptations from that strength and conditioning perspective, as well as the hyperglycogen storage, if you know what I mean? Because we'll do it through training, through training volume and intensity. And is that adding the deficit, adding to that effect as well, that we have a more crazy environment or more of a demanding environment? Yes.
That comes back into those energy systems and that fuel availability. When you're there's a saying in sports nutrition: train low, compete high. Train in a low environment, low dietetic environment. That in that context, I was specifically talking about barometric pressure. Training in an oxygen deprived environment, competing in an oxygen high environment affects those metabolic enzymes. So when we look at
like altitude training kind of thing.
Yeah, altitude training. So altitude training is, have either of you tried altitude training before?
I've been at 4,500 meters, I think. And I decided to go for a run. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, right?
Yep.
I literally ran for 15 minutes. Gosh, I'm not joking. You know when you're just like panting, you're out of breath?
Can't get Aaron.
And it was for 45 minutes. 45 minutes I was sat still and I could not catch my breath. I thought I was going to die. So it was fucking terrifying. Honestly, it was terrifying.
Yep.
But yeah.
So
it sounds like it feels like it's been winded.
It feels like there's no air available, like it feels claustrophobic.
It's like if you can only take a third of a breath at a time, but you're also heavily fatigued and you've been doing sprints and stuff, it's like...
You're heavily fatigued because there's not that intermediary short-term recovery available because the oxygen's not there. So that effect happens where metabolic availability of fuels is less. So if we're looking just in a general strength training context, because you're undernourished, you have less fuels available, so your body has to adapt to get better at dealing with the fuels you do have available. That's one context in which your strength training improves. The second context is psychological. So what was your brain doing when you were doing that 15-minute run?
When I was in the 15-minute run?
Yeah. How did you feel and what were you thinking through that context? Were you freaking out?
Yeah, it was panic.
Yeah, panic.
It's genuine panic towards the end. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that whole psychological thing, if you're training in a really, really psychologically tough environment, i.e. undernourished, things feel hard. You're having to use a lot more of your psychological approaches to get through that session. So, and this is one of the things we talked about it in more emphasis being placed on that psychology of amping yourself up and talking yourself into it and making sure you can get through that session. So that
I have noticed changes.
Yeah. So that when you are back into that and you think about it, you're constantly reinforcing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. The harder it becomes, you have to put more emphasis on reinforcing all those psychological techniques you need to get through that session. When it comes to being in an environment where your physiology has got plenty of fuels available and there's not that feeling of perceived exertion, and you've already got all those psychological systems in place, you're going to perform better if you've then got, you're physically feeling better, and then you've got all these psychological systems put in place that you've employed constantly throughout the past couple of months to get through that session. It's sort of like, if you think about in context of that running session, if you try and there's a couple of gyms across Brisbane that have altitude training in them, so you can go
like a hyperbaric chamber kind of thing.
Yeah. There's a whole gyms here that are altitude gyms, so you can go and do a cycle class in an altitude gym to offset to create an effect. If you went and did a run on a treadmill in a hyperbaric chamber for 15 minutes and then went outside and did a run for 15 minutes, how easy would that run outside feel by comparison?
Right. So what's interesting is I was at altitude. So I was traveling. So I was in the Andes. Right. So I was at altitude for over a month. I was above 3,000 meters for about 6 weeks. Right. We came down to sea level and I went for a run. And I've never been a long distance runner ever. Never been my thing. I went for a run and I just could have kept going and going and going and going. It was insane. But also the air felt like I was breathing in soup.
Yep.
It was so thick, because of the difference.
So
it
that's
was insane.
That's a two context. That's a physiological difference and also a perceived exertion difference. So in strength training, we look at rate of perceived exertion as a way to modify the intensity of our training sessions and has a way to taper up and taper down. Rate of perceived exertion is basically your psychology telling you how hard it is.
Right.
If we used to training at a really high RPE and then suddenly we're in an environment where the RPE is quite low and then we physiologically have the metabolic adaptations to deal with it, we can perform really, really well. With regards to like that effect you saw with the running, 6 weeks at altitude is enough to create that metabolic adaptation. So you had that metabolic adaptation as well as a physiological change of the air pressure and the part of your mind not going into panic and going, oh, I can do this. This is really easy because I've just been doing it really, really rough for the last couple of weeks. So when things feel easier combined with you physiologically have change within your body, performance increases astronomically.
It's like the military mantra is like train hard, fight easy. With application then, if we have a strength athlete, so when you'll have nutrition to help with try to attain, an adaptive stimulus, neurological adaptive stimulus. Now, if we're undernourished and unable to get this, or will it affect our ability to hit adaptive load that we're trying to hit? So if we figure that our adaptive load is a lot higher than down here, but the deficit's forcing us to train a bit lower, or are we trying to psychologically push ourselves, or are we just not going to receive the adaptation, or are we going to be suppressed to the point that training at a... Do you kind of know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
Because there's so many...
So are you suggesting that at a point that the dietary...
Maybe
impacting your ability to get enough volume in the load to cause the adaptation at a training level? Does that mean...
To get
the right they're not
adaptive stimulus.
Right, yeah, okay.
That's a really hard one to answer, being that would apply if you're under the presumption that there's a linear equation to adaptive stimulus equals certain strength numbers.
I thought there was a linear equation for everything when it comes to training.
There's not a linear equation when it comes to metabolic adaptation, though.
Yeah.
So
No, I'm taking the piss. That's what everybody thinks, but there just isn't. Yeah.
I mean, there potentially is a linear equation if you're in a metabolic maintenance constantly, and if we're not modifying metabolism. The whole point of nutritional strategies to improve performance is to modify metabolism. So just because, like when we're looking at powerlifting, for example, if you've tracked out what numbers you need to hit for competition to win, what numbers you need to hit leading into a certain phase into your training block, if you're not hitting them, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to hit competition numbers. If we're looking at nutritional strategies. So it can often be difficult because most coaches go on a linear trend of you need to hit these numbers by this stage or you're not going to hit these numbers at competition, which as soon as you tell someone they're not going to hit numbers by competition, they're not going to hit numbers by competition because you've put a psychological dam in place. With nutrition, you're training in that undernourished environment, that's not going to happen. So you're not going to hit those same numbers, but you're going to have a metabolic different response when you're training or when you're competing in a nourished environment. So we look at your run at altitude. This is a really simple one to explain. If I said to you, you need to run 2.4 kilometers in under 8 minutes at altitude, how much would that have freaked you out?
A lot.
A lot.
Like, yeah.
And 6 weeks of that, busting your ass, trying to hit 2.4 kilometers in under 8 minutes, and you probably still wouldn't have even been able to get that because the whole time your brain's going, oh my God, this is so hard, panic. 6 weeks later, you get down to altitude, you've got a whole heap of metabolic enzymes that have upregulated for oxygenation, so your aerobic energy systems are elevated. Aerobic energy systems increase capacity for endurance, that equates to. Increase recovery for oxidative systems, that equates to. If we then put you through the same test, 2.4 Ks run in under 8 minutes, you probably would have smashed it out in 7.
Yeah.
And you would have got to the 7 minutes and gone, that was easy. It doesn't necessarily mean when you're training at a low environment that you're not going to get the effect at a high environment. In fact, it usually means that's not the purpose at all. That's definitely not going to happen. Ergo, it's not a linear response to training in a low environment doesn't mean you're not going to achieve the results that you're trying to achieve. The whole point is we want to actually make it harder for you. The harder it is during those sessions, in that undernourished environment, it can often mean as soon as we put you in a well-nourished environment, you're going to perform exponentially better.
Would you periodize this in a way for, someone, because it kind of, at the same time, we're testing our numbers to know what outcomes we're going to have during competition. And obviously the more advanced you get, you don't need to hit exactly maximal performance all the time or at all until competition. Would you aim to cycle a diet in a way during testing phases, like during a peak phase where I'm trying to, let's say there's might be a three week build up to something, all the volumes back here, which we could have done maybe in a deficit, but if we got a 3 week phase of a build up, what would be an approach? Would we look at having a refeed or keep them under?
That question's how long's a piece of string, and it's highly dependent on the individual and the circumstance. So it depends on where we are in regards to time frame out from that competition. So it's pointless titrating that up to get the hypercompensation effect if we then are not going to deplete someone enough leading into competition to mimic that hypercompensation. So that second hypercompensation might not be as big. So it's really great if we want to test the theory out and hit really great numbers and go, this is what I'm going to hit in competition. But then getting to competition, we haven't actually hit those numbers.
I guess it's probably a similar approach that I take anyway, because I'll start to increase intensity to that testing point, but I'll maintain volume and under fatigue. And I get biofeedback about how far into fatigue, how fatigued they are, because I'll start to feel pretty shitty and their motivation will start to drop off, and this is where I keep them going depending on their phase. So, I manage it earlier in the prep, but when it gets closer, when it gets to that end, I'm generally trying to maintain it, and I want them to test under fatigue.
Yep.
Because then we'll get that compensation effect at the end.
Yep.
Because then I'll know by the time the competition comes around, those numbers that seemed a bit harder, even though you might have been, because they might have put, say, 2.5% in during that testing under a huge amount of fatigue.
Yep.
Then I know that's an easy second attempt.
Yeah.
So then we've got a huge compensation effect. Yeah.
Yeah, we do. And I think with the athlete, making them aware of when you're testing those numbers, this is an increased fatigue load and this is an increased stress load with the training volume that you're doing, as well as with the undernourished environment. You're not going to hit the same numbers that you will at competition. So we're trying to see what numbers. If you hit the numbers you're aiming for at competition, it means you're going to supersede those at competition. As long as they're aware, because there can be a psychological dampening effect of, if they go into that session going, shit, I didn't hit the numbers that I wanted for competition, this means I'm not going to hit the numbers, and then they're in their heads too much leading into that competition. So as long as the athlete knows that we're testing you under those hard environments for that purpose, we want to test you in a hard environment so that when you get to competition, it's not a hard environment, you're going to perform better.
So yeah, the concept seems to be the same, just under different discipline.
Banners,
yeah.
Do you put any effort into prepping them psychologically for going through that in that context? Like, do you say to the athlete, look, don't worry about what you lift, just kind of trust me? Is that? I mean, I guess that's probably the whole way through what you're saying, but just trust me.
I think saying the thing is just different for every single person.
Athlete,
I'll get feedback from them constantly, and just like how you're doing, it's just I'm managing their expectations and what they, and try and get them to understand what they're feeling.
Yeah.
And whether or not I make a decision to, because I don't give them I don't give them expectations that they're going to hit, massive testing numbers. And it's clear, and people understand my coaching is that we generally don't. We don't have the expectations that we're going to be testing maximal numbers, because the whole point is to just know enough to get us to competition, than to hit massive PBs in the gym, because that's just for your ego.
But what about Instagram?
So what would be then, what your thoughts on the approach of just eating, comparing just eating to recover and perform, optimally or maximally, comparing to utilizing a super compensation effect?
You won't hit as good as numbers.
How long are these phases, by the way, to get this effect? Just top level, and I know it'll depend person to person, but roughly how long is your cut and then refeed? How long? What's the cycle length?
The research isn't clear, but anecdotally from experience, somewhere between, depending on individual, between about 8 to 10 weeks.
Right. Okay.
So you said the effect is best in that first week or two, right?
Yep.
But the effect can hold for about
3 months.
3 months.
Nice.
Depending on the length of the diet. So like if we take someone through a 30-week diet, they'll get 3 to 4 months, maybe 5 months out of supercompensation, but it's not a linear increase. It's the first 6 weeks are huge, big increases. And then it sort of starts to slow down and it plateaus out. So even with the athletes that I work with year to year, so ones that I've been working with for 3-4 years, we'll take them through once, twice a year, what I call a mini cut, which will be a 6 to 10 week diet, 8 to 10 week diet, to resensitize them.
Mm-hmm. The reason why this topic interests me, because it's very different to the approach I've always taken with all my clients. It's always been eat to recover, eat to perform, and we try to get them eating to a lot, get them in a lot. With now, and with that, I mean, I have produced awesome results. Generally, though, without managing body weight at all times, they will put on weight, but still get pretty strong. So I've got probably at least 5 or 6 girls that have squatted over 200, and manage and maintain okay weight. Most of them sitting around the 75 kilo class. They're normally not small girls. So it is challenging, I guess approach that I've always have taken, which is why this is interesting me as a perhaps another approach or a tool that we can implement.
As a rule of thumb, what I found is about a 10% body weight change is enough to create a massive supercompensation effect.
Mm-hmm.
So, which roughly equates to somewhere between that 8 to 10 week mark.
Would you cycle for a strength athlete? Would you think about cycling, or would you cycling this effect where, let's say we're clearly in range of our weight targets and stuff, like body weight targets, you'll go through a phase where we won't use a compensation effect, or you find that will always supersede?
It always supersedes. I will always cycle it throughout the 12 months.
Right, so you're constantly cycling through this. There's no, and there's no ill effects that you know of from that process. This cut refeed kind of cycle.
No, I found it helps all of the clients that I've had end up with better metabolic profiles out of it.
Right. Okay.
Because you're constantly creating, and the way that I worked, we make sure everyone's well nourished. So even during those undernourished environments, they're still getting, the micronutrients that they need, and then never aggressive enough diets where I'm putting someone in a, 500 calorie diet.
So this is going to add another. This is just another tool to add to, because we'll get massive plateaus at times with athletes as well, and you're always looking at strategies to help them get stronger. And the way I always think about things is I always look at things from a anatomy, biomechanical eye, where I'm just squeezing efficiency out of every possible joint I can to gain progress. And just changing the level of ankle mobility can carry over to an extra 20 kilos because they can position themselves better in the hole at the bottom of the squat.
Well, we're doing that metabolically with food.
Yeah, so it's just really fascinating that if we could bring all these worlds together, what kind of beast we can create.
Well, I mean, you're talking about the better funded professional sports there, aren't you? I guess that's what they would have. I'm thinking like NFL, stuff like that. You've got
but this is an
team of nutritionists, team of...
This is an individual sport.
Oh, shit, what did I say?
Team sports are actually the worst because of the culture of the food environment.
Yeah,
I
was about to say.
You're talking with... I find people who do individual sports, because they have to have more accountability for their own results in competition, they are a hell of a lot more focused on it. So the clients that I work with on I would call them still amateur professional sports is something that I would consider something you get paid for enough where you don't have to do another job.
Yep.
So most of the clients that I have wouldn't fall into that category. Generally the clients that fall into that category are team sports who have, like you said, a team of professionals. I have worked with those clients before, and they have some of the worst diets I've ever seen. And there's culturally, that's accepted. Their focus in those team sports is primarily things like how much protein, how much creatine, what other supplements can I take, which supplements is one thing that I barely even look at, because we can do so much with just dieting and refeeding someone and making sure they're well nourished and cyclical throughout the phase, that supplements, unless you've got all of that under control, they're only going to contribute 1% to 2%, if that.
So supplements is one of the bees in my bonnet, because I think it's mainly from a marketing standpoint, right? It's disproportionately marketed as a success factor.
Yep.
Just generally in the fitness industry, I think, like buying. buying supplements is a great way to make money off people, right? Like
Absolutely.
pushing supplements.
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Of course, but your recommendation is, unless you're at the top of the tree and you've got everything, all your other shit together, there's just no point, pretty much.
No. So
Right.
the only time that I've really dabbled with supplements to help our athletic performance is things like, for example, when we have, say, for example, like MMA fighting, there are some supplements that have some sort of okay research against for helping with strength, power, velocity, which when you're looking at fighting sports, if you see a 1% increase in that can be the difference between a knockout and not a knockout.
Yeah.
So there are certain sports where we can supplement, just before going into their ring stage, platform, whatever, that we can see an improvement for, and they can have nutrition 80% good, 20% bad throughout the rest of their season, and it doesn't affect their performance that much, but there are still supplements in that context. But the average, I'd say 99% of individuals, even strength-based athletes, it really doesn't contribute that much. That you're going to see a performance increase.
Interesting.
With, supplements you buy off the shelf of, major brands.
BCAAs is one.
I hate supplements. I think we've all gone through that cycle before.
Well, it's just that idea that there's a magic pill to take. I think
that's the Australian. That's our culture, though. There's quick and easy. If there's an easier way to do it, let's do it. If there's a convenient way to do it, let's do it. So people don't want to work hard. So
you're the what have we've got your nutrition base. We've had a sports physiologist. We've had multiple and the message is the same. The message is the same across, like, nobody seems to want to do the time to make the change, and everybody just wants it immediately. And
immediate satisfaction.
And psychology is completely underutilized in most people. Like they don't understand that the psychology is a massive thing. It's fascinating.
I always say it's like everyone has the potential to make it to the top. I said the only variable, because I've had people who have a high level of talent, just head's not there, and then people who are just unfortunate but will still make it and do really well. The only common variable is just their psychology.
Their drive,
yeah, that is it. They'll always outdo someone who is naturally talented. I mean, if you get best of both worlds,
what is it? Hard work always beats talent until talent works hard.
Yeah.
Then you're screwed. Because when you see those guys,
they're freaks. Yeah,
they're the freaks. Yeah. All right. Well, that answers all my questions for today's topic.
So I got one more, right? Because I hit Gus with this with the hydration one, right? When you look out there, either people seem to fall. It seems to be one of these like political things in that you're one thing or the other, right? I either hear just drink when you're thirsty, not that big a deal, to other people literally prescribing 4 litres a day, and you can see people carrying around these fucking drums, right, and just like constantly chugging this stuff. Where do you fall on the importance of hydration to the elite level performance?
Elite level performance, it's important for everyone. Yeah. Elite level performance, very, very much so. We know that a 2% loss in body weight from fluid can result in performance impairments.
Right.
Performance impairments that are more predominantly neurological based. So when we think of neurological based, we are thinking stuff like, for example, powerlifting. What your nervous system is doing impacts your capacity to lift.
Huge.
Things that require a lot of attention. So like motor car driving, fighting-based sports, which is neurological in that context. Yeah. It's not really going to affect things like aesthetic sports like bodybuilding, or say, for example, a diver. But even stuff like golf, it affects. How well hydrated they are is also complicated with the sports we deal with, because you factor in they have weigh-ins.
Yeah.
And water is one of the biggest targets for modifying quickly what your weight is leading into the competition. With every fighting sport, with every powerlifting sport, you have a weigh-in, whether that's 1 hour, 2 hour, 24-hour weigh-in. So people generally, like, it's culturally not accepted to, want to diet leading into a competition, probably similar to what you've dealt with before, where, oh no, we're not going to be able to perform very well if we're dieting, and the culture is to feed into that. With sports like fighting, they usually do like an 8-week fight camp, and then they diet for the last 10 weeks. So I turn away so many fighters because they'll come to me saying, I've got 15 kilos to lose in 10 days.
Jesus.
Or I want to lose 5 kilos overnight. And to me, I'm like, well, we can do it, but why would you want to? Because you're not going to fight very well the next day. Like, even with 24 hours recovery time, it's not enough time to get you back to maintenance where it's not going to affect your nervous system. And in sports that are highly reliant on good neurological functioning, a slight delay in response, a slight delay in how the motor neuron is fired to the muscle can cause, a slight little turn, which affects your lifting capacity or affects your ability to land a punch or a kick in the time frame that you need it to. So with a lot of the fighters, I'll say, no, we won't do it. Or I'll say, I'll take you on, but not for this for the next one. And we start putting stuff in place now. This is how I plan. This is how I process, so that we're not modifying your water weight.
So much of it too is like I've worked with a few fighters, and it's so much in their culture.
Yeah.
And their coaches too. Like, they drive them into weight classes as well. It's like, you're going into this one.
Urban mythology is huge in fighting, isn't it? It's like shit that they used to do. Fuck, some of them still do handstands for an hour because they think it'll take weight off, and shit they used to do 50 years ago.
Fighting is probably, I've seen the most dangerous stuff happen in that.
Yeah.
With regards to like nutritional strategies leading into the competition, and it's unfortunately an area where, as a sports dietitian, like, we're not dominated in that. The people dominating that advice are coaches who are probably ex-fighters themselves. So it's like just this cultural thing of, this is what we've always done. It's not safe. It's not best practice. But it's, like, it's a boys' club. It's trying to infiltrate into that is really hard, and they're unlikely to want to go to someone outside of that sort of arena if they're not familiar with the culture and familiar with the practices. Or even, I found probably because I'm a small little female, with strength-based sports, with power-based sports, with fighting-based sports, I'm sort of overlooked because of, who I am. I'm a female. I'm a small little female. It doesn't necessarily mean I am not familiar with everything or the nuances that happens, or have best practice in order to get to people where they need to go.
Fucking stupid, isn't it?
I've seen some crazy stuff with them too. Like because I've worked with some of them at high level, and they wanted me to do strength training with them. And it's like, I don't know how barely we can fit any more strength training in there when you're training 2-3 times a day already.
They're kicking off with a half marathon,
massively under eating for the amount of work that they're doing.
Absolutely.
Massive, like just a little deficit, like, and the amount of output they're doing. And it's like, we can't squeeze training in unless you get rid of this much training.
Yeah.
And then we work on getting that food up.
Yeah. Their 8-week camps that they do are intense.
Brutal.
And they burn their nervous system out leading into it, and then want to do things like, cut 10 kilos of weight leading into
and then fight to the fucking death the
and
next
then
day.
fight to death.
It's interesting. I remember reading that they linked, oh God, I can't remember where I read it, but they decided to add weight classes because they found that brain trauma as a result of knockouts was like a lot more common in the low weight classes when it came to professional boxing, and they found it just never happened at the bigger guys. And the reason I think is, and you may just completely shoot me down here, but it was linked to aggressive cutting.
Yeah, because the bigger guys, essentially anything over 100 kilos, those guys don't even diet.
Yeah,
they compete into that. And they train at that all year round.
Just as big as you can be, right?
Yeah. The bigger guys, they don't do generally, as a rule, as a standard rule, they will not do any dieting practices at all. So there's not all the risky behaviours associated with it, and if you don't have all those risk factors associated with it, they're going to perform better. If you, I don't know if anyone else has gone into a diet before, your nervous system is shot when you're in a diet, and when you're really dehydrated, your nervous system is shot. Even your delay in reaction time is shot. There's also, like, what's the inside of your brain looking like if you're not hydrated enough?
Is there enough cushion there?
Is there enough cushion there? There's all these questions and factors. It's going to make you more vulnerable to injury if you can't react as quickly, and if your body isn't in a state where it can accommodate that.
The problem is
you've
with
had
changing.
athletes cut, right? You've had athletes do water cuts, right?
Yeah, I think the problem with federations trying to regulate these practices by changing weight classes and stuff is never going to work, because it's just the
Too
attitude.
culturally.
The attitude is like they're always going to find the most competitive edge. If there's another weight class there, it's like, oh, can I reach that one?
They're going to want to tip down to the one to give them the advantage when they cut, yeah.
Yeah, because I've had fighters that want to compete 2 weight classes below where they stay at all year round. And my recommendation has always been 2 to 3 kilos for a fighter. You shouldn't be competing below 2 to 3 kilos. So 2 to 3 kilos we can deal with. Anything more than that, with what your fight camps are like and the load that's on your body, you're not going to perform where you need to be. So what's the point in going to a weight class below the one you already need to be in to then perform like shit?
Yeah.
You're not going to win that fight anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah, and like you said, I have had people water cut, and it's something I generally always don't recommend. It's probably been like maybe 2 or 3. But these guys were going to win world championships, and
yeah, they're going to take the bigger risks because.
But there's clearly a better strategy. So
Depends how much you have to water cut with them.
It was big. It was big. So this guy, I had one, he wanted to take the all-time squat record in the 90 kilo, which is 362 at 90 kilos. And he was 17 kilos away from he's been down there before, and he already hit the weight. He wanted to go hit that squat. He wanted to go down and hit it again. And I think we dieted off like 10 kilos. No, we dieted off like 8 kilos. And this is a short period of time too. And then water cut the rest. And he said he felt good, but he didn't perform on that day. And it's always the same. So it's like, it's after a certain amount of weight, they never bounce back.
Yeah.
So, yeah, most of them haven't been the best. I actually don't think they've ever been the best outcome. I don't think any of them have been a good outcome.
Yeah.
Unless it's a tiny amount.
Yeah.
None of them have had. When we start hitting that, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kilos. That's.
All over Red Rover.
Well, I guess it makes sense on paper. Like, a lot of this shit makes sense when you think of it as a 1 + 1 = 2 equation. But as you've said, it's so nuanced person to person and situation to situation. And then when you're at the top, those margins are even wider. That it's just never going to be the case, is it? There's just so much more going on that you're probably right. You should just focus on maximising everything you can at, like this. It's not going to give you the edge you want, really, if you've not done everything else you need to do, I guess. So,
No, it's definitely, you definitely opened my eyes. So. Okay, well.
We'll edit that. I mean, we've got. What have we got? Another 40 minutes. So we're pushing 2 hours now.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. I could have gone for another 5 hours.
I had to push you to come in a little bit, didn't I? You didn't do so bad.
Oh, thanks.
That was awesome. Yeah.
I was sitting strategizing. It's like, how can I make her feel a bit comfortable? It's like, I got to get her in a tangent.
Yeah.
So
I'm just not usually good as soon as there's a camera.
Yeah, Gus said. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is like, you're kind of just looking at us, right? And we're having a conversation, so it's different than looking. It's not obvious that there's cameras involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we're trying to get better at that too.
Yeah.
So
it kind of helps that it blends into the dark background too.
Right. Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
All right.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
You're welcome.